elite golfers especially. So their motor skills are so well honed, not much that's going to change that. However, their motor skills are dependent on their sympathetic nervous system not overriding their parasympathetic nervous system. Right? So when that happens, you get poor muscle coordination, poor attention. You might lose concentration. So choking in general. So we found that this biofeedback technique is pretty good for controlling choking, because if you practice enough and you do it enough so that you can use it in the right situation, you're able then to kind of stay closer to the optimal level of arousal.
Welcome to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. I hope you enjoy. Good morning, Dr. Gevirtz. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Good to be here.
Great. I would like to get started right away. Could you talk a bit about your academic background and also your areas of research interest?
Yes, I'm a psychologist. I teach at Alliant International University in San Diego, distinguished professor. I have a PhD in psychology. And I've been interested in psychophysiology from undergraduate years and on. I was a student of Peter Lang, who was one of the founders of psychophysiology. Over the years, I've developed interest in applied psychophysiology, sometimes called biofeedback, but other aspects as well. And over the last maybe 15, 18 years, I've been especially interested in heart rate variability, and together with Paul Lehrer, kind of developed what's called heart rate variability biofeedback, a certain application of heart rate variability.
And can you just clarify what psychophysiology is, what that term refers to for listeners that might not have heard it?
Psychophysiology is a subfield in psychology that looks at the relationship between psychological factors and physiological factors, especially things that can be measured from the surface. So heart rate, skin conductance, brain waves, muscle tension, respiration, pupillary eye dilation. So it's a field that's trying to develop the science between psychological factors and physiological measures, like the ones I spoke of. It's different than physiological psychology, which looks at central nervous system function, like brain and spinal cord function. But psychophysiology is concerned especially with the autonomic nervous system, as well as other systems that can be measured from the surface, non-invasively usually.
The first piece I wanted to get into was some key terms or concepts to cover, and you already mentioned that first term, actually, the autonomic nervous system. So could you explain to the listeners what is the autonomic nervous system, and going into the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system?
Okay, the nervous system is divided into a central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord and brainstem, and the peripheral nervous system, which is the sensory motor system, the voluntary nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system, which is the involuntary nervous system. And that autonomic system is divided into two branches, the sympathetic, which is usually called the fight, flight, fright branch, and the parasympathetic, which is the rest, digest, restore branch. Recently, there's been a lot of interest in the parasympathetic branch that didn't used to be there, because it's much more involved in moment-to-moment regulation of the body, the sympathetic is more involved in regulation during threat or major threat. So there's been a shift in interest from sympathetic to parasympathetic. And within the parasympathetic, the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, has been the focus of a lot of interest, because it's a very important nerve that wanders down to the viscera and controls breathing and heart and gut and internal organs. So there's quite a lot of interest now in vagal regulation, vagal tone from that particular nerve. There's some papers, I wrote one paper, the nerve of that disease, the vagus. There's a number of other people who have used that kind of title.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so can you touch a bit more on this vagus nerve and what it is exactly, and also vagal tone as it pertains to the vagus nerve?
Yeah, so the vagus is largely a restorative, sort of inhibitory nerve that, for the heart, that runs down and puts a kind of constant braking on the heart, except in situations of dire threat. And it's an interesting kind of a brake. It's a rhythmic brake, so that as you breathe in, it takes the brake off of your heart, so your heart rate goes up. And as you breathe out, it puts the brake back on, which makes sense because you'd want your heart rate to be faster when there's oxygen present. And when you're exhaling, you really don't need a fast heart rate, so it actually slows it down. On the other hand, for the gut, the vagus is the main regulatory nerve for the gut, all the way from esophagus to the other end. And it plays a very important role in regulatory digestion, regulation of the gut as a whole. So it's very important in that way.
And vagal tone, what does that word mean?
So vagal tone is kind of a construct for how well is that brake working, right? So we can't really get in there and measure it directly in humans. In animals you can, but not in humans. And so in humans, we measure it indirectly by seeing how well the heart is going up during inhalation and down during exhalation. And so in healthy people, there's quite a lot of variability in the heart rate and rest, because that vagal brake is working to make all kinds of adjustments within the body. So we call the overall ability of that nerve to control the heart vagal tone, which is really not, it is a construct that we don't really have a measure of tone, but we're inferring it from beat-to-beat heart rates during breathing.
And this, you mentioned this heart rate slows down on the exhale and increases on the inhale. And if I'm correct, is that this respiratory sinus arrhythmia phenomenon?
Strange name that was given to it. Sounds like something wrong, but it's actually a healthy arrhythmia.
Okay.
So respiratory sinus, it's breathing. The sinus node is the pacemaker of the heart, and it's sort of an arrhythmia because it goes up and down, although that's a bad name. People get confused because it sounds like something wrong, but it's a healthy arrhythmia.
Okay.
And it is called RSA, and it's pretty much vagal tone is the same thing. We just get it from a little bit different kind of measurement, but basically the amount of respiratory sinus arrhythmia is the same thing as vagal tone.
Okay, so it refers to this increase in heart rate during the inhale versus a decrease in slowing down of the heart rate during the exhale.
Yeah, and crudely, if you measure just the valley of the heart rate beat by beat to the peak of the heart rate and do average those, that is the same thing as vagal tone or average RSA.
One of the last terms I wanted to go into before moving on to heart rate variability was baroreflex and baroreceptors. Could you touch on those, what those are?
Yeah, in the body there are two sets of receptor cells, one in the aortic arch and one in the carotid, that are pressure-sensitive cells, and they're called the baroreceptors. So as blood pressure goes up, it stretches the tissue around those cells, and they have a specialized role of firing back to the heart. So when blood pressure goes up, they inhibit heart rate to try to bring blood pressure down. When blood pressure goes down, they stimulate heart rate to try to bring blood pressure back up. So blood pressure variability is a bad thing at rest. Heart rate variability is a good thing because the heart is doing all the work to kind of regulate the blood pressure. And so the baroreflex is the reflex that I just talked about, the speeding and slowing during blood pressure variations. So in dire situations, like if you had a blood loss, the baroreceptor is really important because it tries to keep your blood pressure up. If you lose blood pressure, you die. And when blood pressure gets too high, it tries to bring it back down again. And so it's another feedback loop in the body that reflects the rhythms of blood pressure, whatever they may be. And blood pressure has its own rhythm in the body of about 7 times a minute. So that means that the heart rate is getting input from blood pressure receptors about 6 or 7 times a minute, going up and down, at a very slow rate of blood pressure changes.
I wanted to move on to heart rate variability and this idea of self-regulation. In general, can you explain for the general population, why should they care about their heart rate variability? And I guess first off, what is heart rate variability, although it is in the name essentially?
Yeah, it's confusing to people because they're used to looking at their heart rate on average, just like at the gym. But if you look at heart rate beat to beat to beat, how much difference there is between R waves of the ECG from one beat to the other, you see there's quite a lot of variability between them. That is, heart rate is not a metronome if you look at it in a close way. And the reason that's good is because the heart rate, because of the vagus, the heart rate is making adjustments in the body for all kinds of regulatory phenomena. In order to do that, it has to vary. So heart rate variability, strangely, more variability is better. As you begin to get more and more ill, all those regulatory mechanisms get knocked out, all of a sudden you get flatter and flatter heart rates beat to beat. Has a little bit higher heart rates too. So heart rate variability has become a very well-known index of overall autonomic health, autonomic flexibility, and health in general, really. More variability means your body's making the adjustments it needs to. The analogy I like is, because I'm a sailor, is if I'm sailing my boat from point A to point B across a channel, and I want to steer the straightest line I possibly can to that other side. If I just hold the tiller in one spot, the wind is going to shift me, the tide is going to shift me, I'm going to be moving all over the place. So in order to get a nice straight line, I have to keep on adjusting the tiller. So if you were plotting the tiller, how much I'm changing it, more variability means better navigation, right? Because by using that tiller, I'm doing that to keep a straight line on my course across the water. And that's exactly the same for heart rate variability. If you lose that ability to make adjustments, then pretty much you're off course. Whereas the changes in heart rate through the autonomic nervous system are doing its best to keep everything regulated. To do that, it needs a lot of variability beat to beat to beat.
So if we see higher measures of heart rate variability, that's an indicator that we're physically in a better state, not ill?
Yes. It's a predictor of disease and death, morbidity and mortality, pretty powerful, independent predictor. So heart rate variability, for instance, in people who have had one cardiac event, if you look at them 5 years later, those with high heart rate variability have multiple times better survival than those with low heart rate variability. So it's a predictor of cardiovascular mortality and morbidity, as well as all-cause mortality and morbidity, independent of smoking, exercise, diet, genetics, anything else. It's a strong, independent predictor of health and mortality too.
And what are the factors that influence someone's HRV?
Generally, overall health, but generally autonomic flexibility. But things that knock it down are things that threaten us, like long-term psychological threat and stress. They lower heart rate variability. Many diseases lower heart rate variability, disease process. And in congestive heart failure, you see a continual drop in heart rate variability over the course of the disease. So generally, and then psychological factors like good social connection seems to matter. Exercise makes a big difference. People who exercise regularly usually have higher heart rate variability. So it's just an index of how flexible that regulatory autonomic nervous system is.
Now looking at an athlete population, what would you, if you were trying to convey to an athlete why they should be monitoring or be paying attention to heart rate variability, what would you try to convey to them?
Well, generally athletes have good heart rate variability. They usually have healthy lifestyles, but the one thing that's been popular, it's not a super powerful indicator, but if you overtrain, your heart rate variability goes down. So this has been picked up by a lot of professional teams. So for instance, some of the best soccer players in the world in Europe take their heart rate variability for 5 minutes every morning on a device that gets sent to the strength and conditioning coach. And then he plots that on a graph day by day by day. And if they see that dropping, supposedly they tell the coach to back off a little bit on the training, try and restore the heart rate variability. If it's not dropping, then they don't do that. So it's not, the data on that is not overwhelmingly good, but there is some data that shows that overtraining, you can really see it in ultra endurance sports. Like it's no coincidence that the Olympic trials for the marathon are like 10 weeks before the Olympics, because that's how long it takes to recover from a fast marathon. During that time, generally heart rate variability is lowered after a very competitive marathon. On the other hand, if you're training optimally, it usually keeps heart rate variability in the optimal range for good long periods of time.
Does sleep have an impact on heart rate variability?
It does. Unhealthy sleep lowers heart rate variability. Restorative sleep. During the night of sleep, you get a big gain in your parasympathetic nervous system and a drop in your sympathetic. And if you don't have that, that's another marker for poor health. Your blood pressure is supposed to dip during the night. Again, that's partially due to that parasympathetic nervous system. So sleep does play a role, especially at the extremes. So, somebody with really, really poor sleep will often have very poor heart rate variability. And really good sleep does seem to restore it.
And going back to you mentioned earlier, this baroreflex and baroreceptors, how is that related to heart rate variability, or is that just one of the natural, physiological mechanisms we have in place that is part of that, or could you kind of help clarify that connection there?
Yeah, so we talked about the main source of variability is breathing, right? So you breathe in, brake goes off, breathe out, the brake goes on. But because of the baroreflex, there's a slower rhythm mixed in there, which is from your blood pressure rhythms. So if your blood pressure is healthy, it's varying, let's say 6 times a minute in many people. That means that in addition to the breathing rhythms, there's another slower rhythm at 6 per minute from the baroreceptor from the blood pressure rhythms. And that gets to be important in the biofeedback because that's what we utilize to maximize the HRV biofeedback.
That's a perfect segue. I was going to ask, so we've touched on what heart rate variability is and that we want a high heart rate variability. So what is heart rate variability biofeedback? So what does this biofeedback mean, and how is that different to just regular HRV?
So in HRV, we only measure that during normal breathing. You don't get an accurate reading of that if a person's breathing too slow. So sometimes the meditators, we hook them up and they breathe too slow for us to get a good reading on them. Years ago, we sent a yogi into a cardiologist to get a measurement, and he just happened to be a very naturally slow breather, and he came back with a terrible report from his heart health, even though he was a super healthy guy. So in order to get an accurate measure of heart variability, it's calibrated to breathing like between 12 and 20 breaths a minute. So when we started studying gurus and yogis and Tibetan monks, and we asked them to do whatever kind of breathing meditation they do to be centered and calm, and measured them, we saw that they immediately lowered their breath rate to somewhere between 4.5 and 7 breaths a minute. And whatever breath rate they went to was always the same for each person. Differed from person to person, but it was always the same for that person. And during that breath rate, we noticed that the RSA, the rhythm of the heart rate, was massively increased. Right? So the first physiologist that looked at this said, wow, what's going on here? And there's also an anecdote from our colleague Evgeny Vashilo, who was the cosmonaut physiologist, was watching the heart rate of one of the cosmonauts, and every day for about 20 minutes, he would see their heart rate go way up and way down and way up and way down at about 6 per minute. And he called up to him and he said, Evgeny was in Russia on the ground. He said, what's going on, Yuri? And he said, shut up, I'm meditating. And so he would see these big changes. So there was a bunch of observation that when people breathe at these slow rates, that they get way bigger peaks and valleys. So usually, let's say a healthy person might, during normal breathing, let's say they're breathing 14 breaths a minute. When they breathe in, their heart rate might go, let's say it's an athlete, they might go from 62 beats a minute up to 70, back down to 62, 70 with each breath. But during the slow breathing, they might go from 55 to 85 beats a minute in each breath cycle. Big peaks and valleys. And nobody really thought that was possible, but we observed it. And basically, Evgeny figured it out that what happened is we were creating resonance with the baroreflex. So when you put your two rhythms together, like pushing a kid in a swing in both directions, you get way bigger oscillations. And so if you get your breath rate lined up in the exact right sequence with your blood pressure rhythm, suddenly you get these big peaks and valleys. And we presume, since these yogis were healthy, that there might have some health benefits. So we incorporated that into a Western version of that. We just show people their heart rate and respiration on the screen. And that's what we call biofeedback, and say, make your heart rate and breathing go together as big as it can. And people immediately figure out they have to slow their breath rate down in order to get that to go up. So they immediately figure out the breathing pattern that it takes to do that. And it turns out that we now have a lot of research that everybody has a unique breathing pace for that. It seems to involve diaphragmatic breathing as well. It seems to be maximized when you breathe with your diaphragm, not with your chest. And once you find that rhythm, it turns out, if you're an adult, that's the rhythm for life. It never changes. So mine is 6 per minute. Yours might be 5.5 per minute. Someone else might be 7 per minute. Once we discover where that resonance is, then we train at that frequency on a regular basis, at least 10 minutes a day. More is better. And that turns out to have all kinds of beneficial effects for the autonomic nervous system and for the brain. So we now have 15 years of research showing that kind of biofeedback has pretty powerful positive effects psychologically and physically for the body.
Very interesting. And so the biofeedback part is that when you're tracking the heart rate and the respiration rate, that they're getting feedback in real time while they're doing that. That's the feedback element? It's not that they're doing it while guessing and they're not getting any feedback.
Exactly, yeah. So biofeedback means you're giving auditory or visual or sensory feedback about some physiological component, in this case, heart rate and respiration. And in addition to that, if we have the equipment to do it, we also measure finger temperature and skin conductance on the palms. And inevitably, we see that when people get into resonance frequency, their hands get warmer because they shut off the sympathetic nervous system, so they vasodilate, and their palms get drier because palm sweat is the stress response. In that case, we're kind of watching those as well as watching the respiration and heart rate go together.
And can you explain, so why is diaphragmatic breathing important versus chest breathing?
The diaphragm, if you look at babies breathing, the diaphragm is the primary muscle for respiration. Little babies, if you look at a little baby in the crib, their belly's going up and down, up and down, up and down. As we get to be adults, we sometimes lose that ability. But the diaphragm is like a bellows that pulls the lungs expansion, the lower lobes of the lung, expands them, allows for way better oxygen exchange, and for a more effortless kind of a breathing once you learn to do it. So some people, though, have learned not to do it, so we have to teach them how to breathe with their belly. And once they learn to do it, though, they get more efficient. And it seems to enhance the respiratory sinus arrhythmia as well. Although the evidence in that, we don't have a ton of evidence on that. Some people seem to do just fine with whole body breathing. But generally, we recommend diaphragmatic breathing. It seems to be more beneficial than total chest breathing, which is not very efficient.
And what about breathing nose versus mouth? Is that an important part of doing this type of breathing?
Yeah, if you can. A lot of people don't have nasal passages that allow it, but it looks like nasal breathing is way better during relaxed breathing, not during exercise. Mm-hmm. But during relaxed breathing, the way the air is filtered through the nose and the way it goes in is more efficient for the alveoli. So I think the recommendation is during relaxed breathing, we should do all nasal breathing. It used to be breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. I think now the recommendation is all nasal breathing. Breathe in and out through your nose during relaxed breathing.
Do you have any insights onto why that was that the recommendation was in through the nose, out through the mouth, and now it seems to be changing to just nasal?
It was a yoga technique, I think, that, a lot of stuff, 2,500 years of yoga, right? So we had no idea what was going on. We just kind of believed them. And there are some techniques probably that are beneficial from in-house breathing out, but I think people just picked that up. I've never seen any real strong evidence that was better. And I think now there's modern evidence is that nasal breathing is really important.
Okay, great. So we kind of touched on these other terms, resonance. And so to clarify that in my mind, that's always an interesting term. So basically what you're saying is that when we match up our blood pressure and our heart rate, that's when we get this more powerful relationship. So we get more of those peaks and valleys that are larger, as opposed to when they're out of sync.
Correct.
Okay.
During normal breathing, we don't really need to do that. But during a period of time a day, to artificially breathe at a slow rate seems to strengthen the baroreflex. So we actually have measures to see that baroreflex gets stronger over about 4 or 5 weeks of practice of this. And now we have a lot of evidence that the brain is affected by this too. So the vagus has efferent pathways, that is from the brain to the body, but actually that's only 20% of the fibers. 80% of the fibers are afferent. They go from the body to the brain. So the brain is listening to the body much more than the body's listening to the brain. And so this is really getting to be very important in modern physiology. And now we have a couple of really good studies out of the University of Southern California that show how profoundly the brain is affected by this kind of a biofeedback compared to a sham group that did another kind of biofeedback, but not the right kind, who had no effect on their brain at all. The group that did the HRV biofeedback had powerful effects on all kinds of pathways from the limbic system, from the primitive part of the brain to the newer part of the brain to the frontal lobe, and really strong effects of that. And it was a really good study because they had fMRI data from 52 people in each group, and they had a really clever control group that sort of learned to lower their variability and lower their heart rate. And they really couldn't do it very well, but they thought that was the right thing to do. So they thought they were in the experimental group. And when you look at the outcomes, they didn't change their baroreflex at all. They didn't change their heart rate variability at all, but they had powerful effects. But the real biofeedback group had powerful effects. So now we're looking at not only as the visceral reflexes strengthened, but it looks like the brain benefits a lot from this kind of breathing.
Interesting. So it's a lot. So we're discovering now that there's a lot more communication from our heart to our brain, not just from our brain to our body. And so it sounds like from what you're saying then that breathing in at these certain rates is a way to facilitate communication or impact what's going on within our body. Is that correct to say?
Lower anxiety, lower depression, improved inhibitory pathways, so it lowers cravings, gives you better what we call executive function, that is the ability of your frontal lobe to kind of control the impulses of the rest of your brain. So it's looking more and more like you can improve those kinds of functions with this kind of biofeedback.
And that last point, executive function, seems like also from a athlete performance perspective, or from a, let's say, specifically golfer's perspective. So can you repeat that part about the executive function, what that is? And so you're saying that biofeedback helps with increasing executive function?
Yeah, the more recently evolved parts of our brain have strong inhibitory effect on the more primitive parts of our brain. Because we needed that to be more socially cooperative, tool-making species, so we could evolve to conquer the world and ruin it right now. So we see in a lot of disorders, attention deficit disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, the executive function falls off. It's not able to fully inhibit what's going on in the rest of the brain. So anything that strengthens that ability to kind of use the newer brain to modify what's going on in the older brain is really beneficial. So like in golfers, they're cruising. So in golfers, let's say elite golfers especially, so their motor skills are so well honed, there's not much that's going to change that. However, their motor skills are dependent on their sympathetic nervous system not overriding their parasympathetic nervous system. Right? So when that happens, you get poor muscle coordination, poor attention. You might lose concentration. So choking in general. So we found that this biofeedback technique is pretty good for controlling choking, because if you practice enough and you do it enough so that you can use it in the right situation, you're able then to kind of stay closer to the optimal level of arousal in the sport. So in sports like golf or baseball hitting, gymnastics, it seems to be quite beneficial where there's some preparation time, rhythmic gymnastics, where the time waiting to do the event itself is dangerous if you don't stay in the zone. Right? So with golfers, we can just see that if we watch their physiology, they're walking up to the green and they've got a 12-foot putt for $800,000. Right? That is pretty stressful. Who among us would not be stressed by that? They make that 12-foot putt, they're gonna win $800,000. They might even be vying for fourth place in a tournament, but that could be $800,000 difference. So it's very tough to control your sympathetic nervous system, the fight-flight system, under those circumstances. So we try to teach them to use the breathing, use the techniques that they've used as they're approaching that putt, to try and stay closer to the optimal level of arousal. And it seems to work pretty well under most circumstances. The more overlearned the technique is, the better they are at doing it. Mm-hmm. So we use that. It doesn't seem to be as beneficial for sports that are more dynamic, football, but for place kickers, for instance, I've worked with a couple of pro place kickers. It's a perfect setup for that, right? So you're a place kicker sitting on the sideline watching your team drive for the winning touchdown or field goal. And it's 3rd and 8 on the 14-yard line. And if they don't make the first down, the game is going to be up to you. And you're just sitting there watching them whether they're going to make that first down. And you're sitting all alone on the bench by yourself because the other players don't talk to them. This is a perfect setup for a massive fight-flight response. So we have to teach them to try and get into this, get as much vagal regulation as they can during that time, so that when they go out there to do the kick, they don't pull it or push it. And a number of our colleagues and myself have been successful in doing that with place kicker. So situations like that are the more logical ones to try it on. I was a college soccer coach, and I tried it with regular position players. I don't think it really made much difference for them. But for corner kicks or penalty kicks, it seemed to help keeping them in the zone.
And so physiologically, when we're going through that breathing, then those situations, if we had them hooked up to, device that were measuring different metrics, we would be wanting to see an increase in HRV, and also would we be expecting to see a decrease in heart rate, or not necessarily?
Yeah. So, but they not HRV in the traditional sense. We'd want to see big peaks and valleys in the RSA.
So right, in the respiratory sinus arrhythmia.
Right. So we would see big, because they're breathing slower, right? So they would see big peaks and valleys. And overall, their heart rate would stay lower, yes. Because if the vagal brake is on, it's going to keep your heart rate lower. Mm-hmm. If they completely lose control, then you get rapid heart rate, if you're in a total sympathetic situation, your heart rate zips way up. It needs to. And then there's no variability at all at that point. So.
Okay, so we would expect not so much to see when it wouldn't be focused as much on the heart variability, we would be more focused on the difference between the lowest heart rate and the highest heart rate during the cycles.
Variability, but it's not the kind we measure at rest.
Mm-hmm.
That's a confusing thing. So all the metrics that we have for heart variability are predicated on breathing during normal breathing. But when you breathe slower, you're not breathing in that range anymore, so those metrics don't work. However, you do get more variability, but it's a specific kind of variability, as you said, RSA.
Yeah. And so when you were touching on earlier, like those soccer players that do a morning readiness, during that time, they're not practicing their breathing, they are just breathing.
Correct.
And then you are tracking changes day to day, week to week during those normal breathing patterns.
Correct.
Correct. Whereas when you're doing biofeedback, you're actually trying to breathe at a very specific pace and trying to elicit a physiological response.
Correct.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to the Golf Performance newsletter. This is where I share written, audio, and video content designed to help golfers take their game to the next level. All the relevant links from today's episode and to the newsletter can be found below. See you next time.